Hi, I'm Michael Chighel, Dean of the new Graduate School for Jewish Studies in Budapest, the Ashkenazium. I have with me an old and dear friend, Professor Henry Abramson, Dean of Touro College in New York, Professor of Jewish History, specialist in Ukrainian Jewish history, but quite well known across the world on the internet for his broad encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish history and his engaging style of presenting Jewish history. And we are so lucky to have him on our faculty at the Ashkenazium. Okay, let's start with the obvious question. What is it that drew you to Jewish studies in general and the study of Jewish history in particular?
Those are excellent questions, and I'm embarrassed to tell you the truth about those questions. As you know, because we go way back, we're both Canadians, eh? My first degree...
We're like Bob and Doug McKenzie almost, basically, right? The Jewish Bob and Doug.
You have to cut this stuff out for sure. But my first degree was in philosophy, and I really enjoyed it, and it prepared me very well for life outside of university. I became a professional ski instructor. And then I realized once I met my wife that, there was no way that we were going to be able to pay day school tuition with a philosopher's salary. You may have disproved me on that one. But what ended up happening was I decided I better go back to school and do something more practical. And two important things, presented themselves to me. First was I realized that what I especially enjoyed about studying philosophy was really the history of ideas part. I loved seeing how certain ideas of varying quality nevertheless had massive impact on human populations and civilizations and so on. And the second thing is, which I'm kind of embarrassed about, is all of my history professors, as opposed to those in other disciplines, they all wore suits. And I figured they must make more money. So I chose to go back and study history. And that's what really drew me to it. But the study of Jewish history, well, I always found that the Jews are such a fascinating population. Obviously, there's the personal connection to it, but it's just such an uncanny story that this tiny people should survive such incredible challenges to their political, establishment, to their dispersal, to their frequent persecution, and yet nevertheless, they should continue to contribute to world civilization on such a dramatic level that's so disproportionate to their numbers. And so, I mean, they're intrinsically fascinating. I think everybody should be fascinated with them.
It's interesting. You started your career by focusing on Jewish Ukrainian history, and you didn't remain in that niche. What's really nice is you're actually probably more famous these days for an encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish history, right? You're the new Salo Baron, I guess, or the...
Oh, come on. That's way too much.
Okay,
the lachrymose conception of Jewish history there. But please go on. Sorry, those compliments were really nice.
Yeah, well, what I'm just pointing that out because as you say right now, that you were interested in the Jewish people as a whole. So it's not just this narrow enclave of Judaism, but actually Jews as a whole. And that's exactly what you're doing right now. And why we've invited you to come to Ashkenazium to teach on Jewish Ashkenazi history as a whole.
So the question was, how come I was so narrowly focused on Ukrainian Jewish history first, and then...
Actually, it was a reflection. I don't know if it was a question, but yeah, okay, let's start with that.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's personal and professional as well. My wife is, her family comes from Ukraine, and her late father was interested in history. So this was kind of, on top of the fact that I thought historians made more money because they wore suits, I saw this as an opportunity to have a closer relationship with my father-in-law. And so I read some English language works on Ukrainian history, and Mikhail Khrushchevsky's History of Ukraine, and then Subtelny's history, and Doroshenko, and I found the Ukrainians also quite fascinating, and the long intersection of Jewish and Ukrainian history, which goes back well over a millennium, also fascinated me, particularly because, when you and I were educated in the 1980s and 1990s in particular, there was a lot of controversy surrounding Ukrainians and Jews in Canada. There was a commission called the Deschênes Commission, which tried to look into the participation of Ukrainians, in particular military units, and there's really a lot of political hoo-ha about it. And so I sort of fell into that area for quite felicitous personal reasons and scholarly reasons. I was also quite fortunate to have found a most amazing personal academic advisor, Dr. Paul Robert Magachi, who is the chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, phenomenal scholar who really took me under his wing and showed me the ropes to mix my metaphors of what it means to be an academic, and especially to be an academic who's somewhat controversial as he was. Later, as a result of many things in my career and shifting interests, I really felt that although I could continue to write in Ukrainian Jewish history, and it's a very productive area, and there's definitely a lot of great things to research, and I would probably have about 12 or 15 people who read my books. But I felt that it was far more important at this juncture in history to try and popularize Jewish history, even if my command of other areas of Jewish history is much more superficial. Nevertheless, I see myself in later years as someone who popularizes Jewish history and hopefully inspires others to reach deep into their specific areas of inquiry.
So you know what? Let me ask you then, why? It's interesting the way you phrase it. It's as if it's a kind of personal mandate, almost a kind of shlichus, right?
Oh.
A kind of Well, I mean, it sounds like you're a man on a mission. You're like one of the Blues Brothers, a man on a mission from God.
Yes. Pack of cigarettes.
You got a nice blue background. I love the Dead Sea Scrolls in blue. It's beautiful. No, so really, I mean, it sounds like there's more at stake than just being another famous guy in a good suit. I mean, you actually, there's this idea that Jewish history is really worth knowing beyond the ivory tower.
Well, there's so many things there, Michael. First of all, thank you for the compliment on the suit.
That's the main thing. I just want to make sure that your dream has come true. So that I just want to emphasize that you accomplished at least half of what you wanted to do. That's there's no doubt there.
Wearing a suit can make my students think I make more money. No, I think like Jake and Elwood, I do consider myself on a mission from God. I think that we do have our shlichus, our role as emissaries, and if I have any talent, and I think I've discovered it when I studied Ukrainian Jewish history, if I have any talent, it's I think not so much in my insightful mind and my ability to amass huge amounts of information and things like that. I think it's in my limited ability to take very complicated things and explain them in a relatively engaging manner that intelligent lay people enjoy. I mean, you mentioned earlier Salo Baron. You compared me to him, which was like, wow, that was too much already. Salo Baron, for the audience who might not be familiar with these, one of the last great encyclopedic historians who wrote this massive, I think it's 18-volume, social and religious history of the Jews. A hugely important scholarly work that is incredibly difficult to read. I mean, he just sort of takes it for granted that you're an advanced graduate student who is familiar with the broad contours of the story, and he goes straight to high-level academics right away. And it's dense and incredibly, powerful and very useful. Even though it was written half a century ago, it still has tremendous legs for scholars today, but it is almost entirely unread. It sits in the reference shelf of libraries and nobody accesses it. So I think that in terms of my personal skills, I'm not a Salo Baron by any means, but I think I can explain a lot of complicated things in a way that a lot of people can access. That's what made me more useful, I think, as a Ukrainian Jewish historian is that, the Ukrainians have a particular view, especially of 20th century history. The Jews have a very different view of it. And I was able, in some degree, to explain to each community how the other sees that particular shared history.
I probably should have compared you to Heinrich Gretz, I guess, because his history is much more populist, at least in style, right? And I think he intended that. That was actually the purpose behind it, was to make it very legible to the pedestrian. But tell me, I want to push you still on this question, because there's a philosophical issue, and I know you can handle it. You seem to imply that there's actually a value for the simple, it's a horrible term, really, simple Jew. It's not the simple Jew. It's the non-ivory tower, non-specialist Jew to be in touch with Jewish history.
Not just Jew.
Or non-Jew. Good point. Good point. Right.
YouTube doesn't have that filter where I can say Jews only, So
right. Well, actually, that's very good. Somebody recently asked me about the Ashkenazium, and they said, this is what kind of yeshiva are you opening here? And I said, this is not a yeshiva. It's a university program that's open to Jews and non-Jews. And specifically because I believe, as I hope you do, that Ashkenazi history has value to all human beings, certainly to Western human beings, as a kind of maybe a kind of extended psychoanalysis, just trying to understand themselves. But I'm just wondering, in your perspective, why do you think Jewish history is important for every Jew?
Well, that's huge, Michael. Yes, some really.
Let me pose the question this way. I'm sorry, and you take your time to think about this, because, for example, I think you ask an average rabbi, how important is Jewish history, or what was the most important thing for a Jew to spend time reading? I only have a finite amount of hours during the day I need to study. So a rabbi will say, well, clearly Torah, Talmud, Halacha, right? But Professor Henry Abramson says, well, I'm sure you agree with that. You've published a book on the Talmud. So it's not like you disagree with that. But what you're saying is that besides that, there's an actual intrinsic value to studying Jewish history.
Wow, excellent. So many questions. So first of all, I think you are right that if I deserve any comparisons to encyclopedic Jewish historians, I think Gretz is a much closer model than Baron. Dubno might also be a good one too. But Gretz was on a mission. He was maybe not the first encyclopedic historian, but one of the most important. And he wanted to sort of do two things, I think. He wanted to restore Jewish pride. That was a huge thing for him. His work is very heroic in nature. And it is from him that we get this kind of strong model of the Jews are constantly persecuted and look how much they achieve and they thrive at the same time. And that was designed to try and promote the cause of Jewish emancipation, trying to prove to Germans in particular that Jews are worthy, would-be full citizens of this future German republic. And so he was trying to make the case both to Jews that they should take heart, they should not head for the doors as they were with widespread conversion to Protestant Christianity, and also make the case to the Germans that, hey, Jews are vital and essential members of our society. So I find a lot of resonance with many of those motives for, I think, obvious reasons. I
like that a lot, actually.
Well,
it's just my immediate reaction to it is it seems to me that you're making a connection between I don't know what to call it, maybe dignity, pride, pride and dignity, the sense of self, the sense of identity that comes with dignity, and you're tying that with the knowledge of history. In other words, my dignity is somehow predicated on knowing where I come from, knowing where we come from.
You're absolutely right. I think there's so much to that. In terms of Gretz, I think that some of the weaknesses of his approach was that he sort of had a paradigm in mind of the ideal Jew, who was, for example, anti-Hasidic, anti-Kabbalistic, and very westernized in nature. He had kind of an idealized sense of Maimonides as the perfect Jew. And Maimonides was a hugely controversial figure in his day, for example. And I think that skewed a lot of his thinking. I'm not exactly sure how my thinking is skewed, but I'm definitely although I like his messages and I want to put the gas on a lot of his messages and move forward with them, I also feel that, we live in an age of postmodernism in which, we have to approach a lot of these ideas very differently for a very different audience. I think the similarities are that way more than in Grätz's era in the late 19th century, you have Jews running for the exits. Whereas back in his day, it was really, conversion was, to use Heine's magisterial phrase, my baptism was my ticket to European culture. Today, it's simply just abandonment of identification, abandonment of affiliation, and so on. So that phenomenon is accelerated in our own time, and I feel that is really at a crisis point. But as Marshall Sklar put it, we are the ever-dying people. We're constantly at crises, one to another. And at the same time, I feel that the external threats to Jewish civilization are also quite significant. I mean, we live in a post-Holocaust era. So I think a lot of that kind of like positive and negative polarity that Grätz encountered is something that we feel even more in the 21st century. But to speak to your question of like, what's the deeper reason to this? And I think we have to put it in terms of postmodernism as well. That
good heavens, that you already gotten so deep for me already. So this is great. We're going even deeper here. I'm having time digesting what you just said. But go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, on YouTube you can like slow it down, so when people replay it, they can slow it down. I was listening to a great podcast by a New York colleague of ours named David Bashevkin, and he interviewed a Professor Chighel. I've forgotten his first name, but he's an analytic philosopher, and he made a very interesting distinction between beliefs which are true in themselves. By the way, a plug for the podcast, 1840, the number 18, the word 40.org. Really great stuff there. But he made a distinction between beliefs which are objectively true in themselves, like if a person stops believing them, those things remain true nevertheless, and beliefs which are unprovable, but nevertheless still rational to believe in them. And I think this is a huge distinction in epistemology that, we tend to think of Judaism as being something that demands complete adherence to the former, meaning I believe that God exists, for example, that there's a special role for the Jewish people in civilization and so on. And if I am not completely attached to that idea, then there's no value in the entire enterprise. But on the other hand, the other kind of belief, which is much more friendly to postmodernism, is that, you may not be able to ultimately prove that existence of a thing if people are no longer perceiving it, like kind of a Descartes model, but you can at least say that this belief is rational, and that people who do so believe are in themselves rational, and so it's within the realm of possible discourse. So given that we've kind of bifurcated those types of beliefs in our society today, and that I think most Jews, unfortunately, have never really engaged the possibility of the latter, of the idea of it being rational, to contemplate this destiny for the Jews that is divine in origin. I think it behooves us to provide easy on-ramps to that possibility. And I believe that history is the slowest route up. And people don't have to get on this route. They can walk all the way up the route and then say, well, that was really an interesting trip. And then they can walk back down again. It's entirely up to them. But nevertheless, I believe that history is not necessarily intrinsic in value, as you put it. I think it is still fundamentally extrinsic, that it is good for something else. It is good for bringing people closer to Torah. And of course, Torah is inclusive of non-Jews in this respect as well, because we all share one planet, and the inscrutability of God has nevertheless put us all together in one big family, even though we may have different destinies. I believe that what makes history so perfect as this easy on-ramp is that it is a narrative. And human beings love narratives. We love stories. We love connections. That's how we organize our world. And when you look at the incredible plot twists of Jewish history, it's just hard to believe. It's just overwhelming. So I believe that Jewish history, to bring this to a close, I believe that Jewish history just has so much phenomenal power to amaze and astound and inspire that people just want to get caught up in it. It's hard for me to know because YouTube doesn't give me the detailed analytics, but I'm pretty sure from the comments that people write that well over half of my fairly significant following on YouTube are non-Jews. And they just find it interesting. It is, Taka, interesting.
Well, there is, for better and or for worse, there really is such a thing as a Jewish mystique. Because I think many people know that we, per capita, tend to be overrepresented in many intellectual fields and so on. And again, that's for better and for worse, unfortunately. So I'm not surprised that a lot of non-Jews would be interested in this. I actually want to get on to ask about the kinds of things you're going to talk about in the course in Ashkenazium, but because—
Can I just respond to that mystique part for a minute? Just for a second, that although I love the Jewish mystique, it's great for like getting people interested. There are a lot of really good historical reasons to explain it. I mean, urbanization, literacy, numeracy. It's tempting to get very essentialist and say, well, Jews are different, but there's lots of comparisons with other peoples who have similar, sort of demographic features that take away some of the mystique. But that's okay. We'll live with it. Anyways, go on.
The take away some of the Jewish mystique, you're saying? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Meaning, like, if you take population Y, let's say, I don't know, Alsatians, and you give them similar rates of literacy, similar rates of numeracy, you have them traditionally live in urban settings, you impose certain external barriers to their advancement that spur them on to find new avenues, new untested economic models, and they're going to end up basically looking like Jews. We have other Jew-like populations because these historical factors, cultural and economic factors come together and create it. The thing about the Jewish people, though, is that it's sustained. It's like, wow.
This is a very deep historical question because you enumerate a number of challenges, and challenges, of course, are always good for strengthening people, but the problem is, are the people going to rise to the challenge? And I'm sure that throughout history, there have been many peoples who have gone extinct like dinosaurs because simply they didn't have the resources with which to rise to the challenge. So, I wonder, maybe this is not a discussion for now, but this is probably on the side of on the more religious side of the way we tend to see reality. But we have to wonder whether the Jewish mystique doesn't have something to do with God. God as the force, whether, even if there is no God, but God is the force that gives us the resources with which to face these challenges, and develop this mystique. But
can I say, I really like the way you say God. Like
God has to be,
backing away.
You always have to, because when you write God, you have to
like a Tai Chi move. Okay, everyone go to
you have to underline, you have to put quotation, you have to do something.
Happy warrior. God pose.
God. You have to, when you say God, you at least have to put a hyphen or something, to make people go, oh, what's going on with this word here? What happened? What happened to language?
Deepened a little bit too. Oh my gosh. The Ashkenazium is going to be a lot of fun. I can tell you that.
It's a lot of fun. It is.
Okay. Anyway, sorry, go on.
I wanted to ask you what you were discussing before, which it strikes me, and this is so interesting because, obviously the two of us are, I think, very much of the same cast of mind on this point, at least, that when you look at Jewish history, the way you were describing it sounds very similar to what the Germans called Heilsgeschichte. That it's, when we look at the history as it's recorded in the Bible, this is not Thucydides, Herodotus, the historians. If you can refer to the prophets as historians, they're writing down this history with a definite cast of mind. They're looking at the salvation. It's called salvational history.
Sure.
So it's not just stam, one damn thing after another, as somebody once famously defined history, but actually there's a narrative here that has a real deep purpose to it. And I find it interesting, and I wonder how you, and I consider myself in the same camp, but I'm just wondering how you balance, on the one hand, this Heilsgeschichte way of looking at things, which is obviously rooted in your temperament, in your personal biography, in your personal commitments. And on the other hand, you are Professor Henry Abramson, a man who has been educated in academia and has disciplined his mind and his writing style and his research style as well as any other academic in any objective field. Mm-hmm. So, isn't there a bit of a tension between these two things? And how do you deal with that tension?
Oh, that is the only question, right? That is the only question.
I'm leaving. That's it. I'm done.
So I gave some thought to this, and I recorded some of my musings in a series of lectures, and there's one of them called, the series is called the Jewish History Lab, and lecture number 42. I remember the number of the lecture because, of course, 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Yeah. Right? What is the meaning of Jewish history? That's the title of the lecture. And I go through some of the philosophical musings of some of these great historians, some of whom we've mentioned already. And I think, I sort of navigate between the Heilsgeschichte and maybe von Ranke's important formulation of wie es eigentlich gewesen war, what actually happened already, sort of approach to Jewish history. And the incredible impact, once again, of postmodernism, which we haven't really discussed, but that's oh my gosh, it is massive. It's like a huge dark cloud that sits on everybody's shoulders, whether you realize it or not, that affects how we approach history. And I believe that the way that I sort of negotiate this problem for myself is I take an approach that was first evinced by the great historian Cecil Roth, really a phenomenal scholar who has not received the same degree of attention as Gretz and Barron and others, although he really was brilliant, mid-century English scholar. And he essentially speaks of a kind of a covenant between the reader and the author, the historian in this case. Whereas, I and my audience, we're both in the same drama, right? We're both acting in the same play. I have a role as historian right now. Other people have the role of an audience, but in reality, we're all audience and we're all participant observers of the phenomenon. And so the nature of this covenant is simply, look, I'm going to be as upfront with my audience with what my proclivities are as I understand them. My struggles with the sources, like how can I evaluate this source fairly, which is very difficult when you look at the Heilsgeschichte model. And I'm just going to lay it out there as best as I see it. And so the writing of history, the editing of the narrative, because it invariably involves editing. You have to exclude certain factors which take away from the narrative, but you have to include factors which invariably disrupt the narrative, but they have to disrupt it. It's all about that agreement, that covenant between who's reading or who's watching my videos. And I'm just trying my best to be as fair to them and as fair to the story as I see it as possible. And I think that's really the way that I can negotiate it. It is very postmodern in nature. It's recognizing the fragility and the ephemeral nature of much of the interpretations we place on the course of human events. But at the same time, it's recognizing that there's something imminent. There's something that glows behind all of this massive data that is begging for it to be revealed. Kind of awkwardly put.
So much more I want to ask you on this point, but I'm gonna leave it at that. I mean, I think the wonderful thing about having somebody like you as a historian is obviously we all have biases that come from commitments, that come from preconceptions. And I think I appreciate, for example, the philosopher Gadamer, who underscored this. He said that and he was talking specifically about the study of history. He says, don't think that there's such a thing as a historian without bias, without any bias. It's just not possible. It's not humanly possible to be without bias. But what's nice about somebody like yourself is that you may have biases like others, but you have done the homework. So, you've covered your bases. I mean, people say all kinds of things, but not very many people can say things and actually have all the footnotes, to back them up. So let me jump to another question, just because, again, like we can sink into this forever. What do you want to do with this course on that you'll be teaching at the Ashkenazium on Ashkenazi history, which is going to be a comprehensive kind of encyclopedic course on the whole of Ashkenaz? Yeah.
I think that's this is going to be so much fun. I mean, this is going to
By the way, I'm going to be sitting in the back of the class, holding my mouth. I don't want to speak, but I can't wait to be sitting there on your lecture. Absolutely.
Well, you're only allowed to audit my classes if you agree not to audit and to actually, verbalize. Right? Okay. You have to actually speak. Audio is not the way I want you in my classes, Michael. Just no hard questions, okay? Just easy ones. So the, Ashkenaz is a massive part of the overall story of the Jewish people. And that in itself makes it so important to study. Especially given our perspective in the early 21st century, as we look back on the incredible flourishing of Ashkenazi culture from, let's say, the 19th century onward, when, as a result of several factors, we've adduced a few of them previously, Jews began to really penetrate the outside world and make huge gains in all, contributions in all areas of human civilization. So I think those things kind of make Ashkenazi history absolutely fantastic. But I'll share with you one thought that I think is emblematic of the way I'd like to approach this. I happen to be reading a text that was published in the early 1960s. It was Irving Adjus has an interesting chapter on the European Jewish community in the Dark Ages. And there's almost nothing happening in Jewish history in the Dark Ages in Ashkenaz, okay? It's true that term in itself is kind of difficult because it's sort of positing that nothing was happening between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, or at least the High Middle Ages, something like that. And of course, there are lots happening, just not necessarily in France and Germany, which is sort of the homeland of Ashkenaz. And he traces the tiniest little data points that we have of the inception of the Ashkenazi Jewish community, like in the 7th century and the 8th century, coming up to the period of Rashi. And he says this amazing theoretical statement. He says that because the early Ashkenazi Jewish communities lacked really prominent authority figures, they were able to create the most vibrant civilization in Jewish history. In other words, because there was no great rabbis to interfere, they were able to just spontaneously develop takanot, right? Like rabbinic, or they're not really rabbinic in this context, but community ordinances, and organize themselves. And if only the rabbis would just like kind of step aside and let us take care of this, that's essentially what created what was so great about Ashkenaz. I'm not sure how I feel about his thesis. I'm going to have to really dig into it deeper. I just happened to see it last night in this very old publication. And I don't think other historians have really picked up on it very much either. But just the idea that there is this spontaneously generated culture in Ashkenaz, which has, on the one hand, a tremendous engagement with Jewish sources in very different ways than had been engaged prior to, let's say, the period of Rashi, and an insatiable curiosity about the outside world that you see in the scientific revolution with people like David Gans, for example, and that somehow is sort of like coiled and waiting until the period of emancipation, when Jews are just beginning to kind of crack the shell of this internal cold fusion engine, and then suddenly you see them spitting out all these radically new theories, like Freud's theory of the mind, and Marx's theory of politics, and Einstein's theory of relativity. Like, where does all that come from? So I think that's what's especially interesting about the history of Ashkenaz. I also think that, the relationship.
Which would imply then that Ashkenazi Jewry, if its distinguishing feature or its glory is somehow bound up with its interaction with non-Jewish culture.
Well, that is really the point, isn't it? Absolutely. And there's so much to say about this. I'm nervous about putting myself on tape because I'm still working through some of these ideas, but let me give you one example of a contrast. The horrific incident of the Crusades that occurred immediately after they were enjoined in late 1095. There was a massacre of 3 really important Rhineland communities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, that had a massive impact on Jewish history and Jewish mentality. It forms part of the basic liturgy and things like that. And we're talking about, maybe 2,000-3,000 people involved. It's not, unfortunately, by the scale of later genocide. It's a tiny fraction. But some historians have argued that as a result of that very negative experience, and I'm not sure that I'm overgeneralizing. I think there are a lot of reasons to say that this is not an accurate understanding of what happened in the Crusades. But as a result of that very negative encounter with the outside world, so to speak, Ashkenazi Jewry became much more insular, curved inward on itself, focused on, ignoring the outside world as being toxic and dangerous and not to be approached. On the other hand, the Sephardim, a couple centuries later, after 1391 in particular, having been forcibly converted in the pogroms of 1391 and then enduring 100 years of, I shouldn't say enduring in this context, going through a century of unprecedented access to European civilization because they were technically converted to Christianity while at the same time still maintaining their faith connections until the Inquisition, of course, came and shut that down really hard. The Sephardic Jewry kind of said, well, you know what? The outside world maybe is not so terrible. I mean, look at what happened in Al-Andalus with the Spanish Golden Age and all these great Hebrew Jewish poets and these great Hebrew Sephardic thinkers. I'm sorry, I said Hebrew Jewish poets. I think that's kind of like redundant. And so Sephardic culture, I think even beyond the expulsion of 1492, had a much more kind of acculturationalist approach to the outside world, which allowed for a much higher rate of survival, particularly in places like North Africa. Even though they were under Nazi domination in World War II, they were much more closely associated with the local population in terms of dress, manners, language, and so on. See it also in France and Bordeaux and Bayonne. They received emancipation earlier than the Ashkenazi Jews of Alsace-Lorraine, for example. So Ashkenazi culture, unlike a lot of Sephardic culture, strove to disengage from the outside world with some success. And I think that colored the way in which they see the world, but they could not repress the essential curiosity about the advancement of science and technology and so on. And so that's why you reach that breaking point in the late 18th century where you have people like Moses Mendelssohn who are saying, what's wrong with appreciating opera, right? There's a lot of cool things in opera. And this generates a dramatic change in how Ashkenazi Jews relate to the outside world. Sorry for that long-winded answer, especially after saying how good I was at explaining complicated things.
No, it's actually a very good answer. I like. Let me just see if I understand it correctly. You're saying that there's something like a kind of a crouching tiger dynamic here, where there's a first part of Ashkenazi history is one where there's a kind of movement inward, an insularity, which is motivated obviously by fear, by terror, but that creates almost a kind of Freudian repression. call it this repressed sense that is released through the Renaissance and through the Enlightenment, and then Jews are able to suddenly explode and participate in Western culture at large.
That was very well said. I'm not sure I completely buy the thesis, but it is one sort of overarching way to envision Ashkenazi history. As a Gedanke experiment, I think it has a lot of value.
So let me ask you this. I know you don't want hard questions, but it's a value question. To what extent do you think that this expansion, which took place, I guess, after the Enlightenment, I guess you would mark the Haskalah, right? The emancipation and Haskalah in the 18th century, right, as the turning point. To what extent is Ashkenazi history after that turning point a compromise? In other words, a compromise specifically of Judaism, of Jewish culture, or contrary-wise, to what extent might it be a non-compromise? In other words, an enrichment of some sort, or is it even both? I guess that's also possible.
Yeah, you're definitely asking hard questions there, but I'll put it like this. I mentioned earlier the golden age, right, of Al-Andalus, the 10th through the 12th centuries in Spain, where you have these remarkable figures like Shmuel HaNagid, who was, on the one hand, extremely adept and a leader of Jewish culture. He was a renowned poet. He was a halachic commentator. He wrote books on the Talmud that are still studied today. And at the same time, he was the general of a Muslim army for 16 years, right? Like, where in Jewish history do you have people who are like famous for being professional Jews and at the same time famous for being professional in the secular world on a very, very high level, kind of a Maimonidean area where, we know him for his Mishnah Torah, his Mor Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, and at the same time, the outside world, at least in his day, knew him for his treatises on depression, on anxiety, on medical issues, and so on. His dictionary of medicine and so on. So he's equally famous in those two realms simultaneously. You don't have that in the Enlightenment period. You don't have that with these great Ashkenazi Jews. So there's no question that people like Freud, Marx, Levi-Strauss, they've got Wittgenstein, right? They've got to jettison their connections to Judaism in order to excel in their field of inquiry. And at the same time, you've got these massive geniuses like the Vilna Gaon, like the Baal Shem Tov. I know I said them in the same sentence there, but you've got these huge spiritual geniuses who are like enlightening the Jewish world on a scale that hasn't been seen in centuries. That's all happening in the same period. So there's definitely kind of a sacrifice to excel in one area and the other. And by the way, we're still living in that area. If you go to Lakewood, New Jersey, you'll find some amazing Talmudic geniuses, but they're not simultaneously, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or something. You don't have that kind of duality in a single person. So I think there's definitely a jettisoning. But at the same time, and this is something that I hope they will have the opportunity to explore in the Ashkenazium, is like there's something maybe hard to quantify, but there is definitely something qualitatively Jewish about all of these people, even if it's only their rejection of Judaism. I was reading this morning, for example, about Isaac Babel, right? One of the great Soviet Jewish writers who tried mightily to describe his Soviet experience, but he could not, push away his Jewish experience at the same time. And he writes about this expression, saying how, he joins the band of violent soldiers, and he talks about how he wishes he could take on their cruel characteristics. They force him, for example, as a trial of his ability, they force him to kill a goose, and he is like tormented by this. why am I killing a goose, right? It's Baltashkis, and what did the goose ever do to me? So there's still that connection to Yiddishkeit that it nevertheless animates those Jews who have kind of spun off into a non-Jewish Judaism.
And would you say also, I love what you're saying, and to take another example, somebody like Freud, who is known for his great critique of religion. That's one of his great accomplishments.
Moses and monotheism, yeah.
And even before, Future of an Illusion, Totem and Taboo, so many of his works were dedicated to the deconstruction of religion on the deepest possible levels of the psyche. And that's what he's known for. And at the same time, when I'm reading Freud, like, gosh, this guy's so Jewish. These ideas, not just that, he has these Jewish hangups, but the actual, the coloring of the ideas, the way he looks at the soul, the way he divides the soul, for example, into different parts, the higher and the lower. To me, it sounds like the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya. There's
Nefesh Bahamis. Yeah.
So I wonder sometimes whether these great apikorsim, these great secular heretical minds, were in some ways actually in a roundabout way, through the back door, they brought in Judaism in a kind of clandestine kind of way.
I think that's a very accurate assessment and very valuable. And look, it's part of the overarching narrative of Jewish history. And, we, in Jewish civilization, we claim them. We claim these apikorsim, like we claim Elisha ben Abuya, Acher. He's part of the Masorah as well, even though, he's weit von Yiddishkeit, as they say. Nevertheless, he's part of our overarching story.
Thank you for joining myself and Henry Abramson, Dean of Touro College and visiting professor at the Ashkenazium. Stay alert for another such video with Benji Balint, world-renowned scholar and author on Franz Kafka. He wrote a great book which has been translated into many languages, Kafka's Last Trial, on the same bat channel, same bat time.